If it's Tuesday, the Justice Department and the SEC open an investigation into the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank as dual bank failures and new warnings about the health of the U.S. banking system keep consumers, the markets, and Washington on edge. Plus, new tensions between Russia and the U.S. as Russian jets intercept and then collide with a U.S. drone over international waters and what U.S. forces are condemning as a reckless and unsafe act by the Russian military. And President Biden breaks with progressives on some key issues as he takes executive action on gun background checks ahead of the expected launch of a 2024 re-election campaign. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Kristen Welker. We begin this hour with the continued instability in the nation's banking system amid mounting questions about what led to the collapse of two key banks. How many more may be at risk, and what, if anything, can be done to prevent this from happening again? Two sources familiar with the matter have now confirmed to NBC News the Justice Department and SEC are investigating Silicon Valley Bank's collapse. That news was first reported by the Wall Street Journal. NBC News can also confirm that the Justice Department will look at why executives at the bank sold shares before it failed. The Justice Department has declined to comment. That comes as just moments ago the markets closed up today for the first time in nearly a week, with regional banks rebounding from their losses yesterday. But in a sign of ongoing concern, one of the big three rating agencies, Moody's, has cut its outlook on the U.S. banking system to negative, citing a rapidly deteriorating operating environment. Meanwhile, the blame game has already begun on Capitol Hill, with House Speaker Kevin McCarthy trying to pin the instability on the Biden administration, tweeting Biden's reckless spending caused record inflation and rapid interest rate hikes that broke family budgets and banks too. We must restore fiscal sanity. The White House responded to that tweet just a few hours ago.
If that argument were the case, you would see many banks facing this kind of situation. Instead, what you're seeing is largely an idiosyncratic situation with a handful of banks. I think the story here at the bottom line is that a set of banks that in the previous administration, Republicans were largely saying these are not systemically important. If something bad happens at one of these banks, it's not going to spread more broadly in the financial system. What we have seen over the last little bit, several days, is that that core argument was incorrect.
Democrats, on the other hand, are blaming deregulation passed under former President Trump. Here was Senator Elizabeth Warren last night on the Rachel Maddow Show.
Congress needs to roll back the Trump bank regulation relief. We need to make a change in the laws, because then that will affect the regulators, and the regulators will make sure that they are engaging in closer supervision over those banks. What should banking be? Banking should be boring. And anybody who wants to take a lot of risk and make a lot of money should not be in banking.
We've got a lot to get into, including some new economic data, so let's dive right into it. I'm joined now by CNBC senior White House correspondent Kayla Tausche, CNBC Global Markets reporter Seema Modi, NBC News business reporter Brian Chung, NBC News correspondent Jake Ward is out in Silicon Valley, and NBC's Ali Vitale is on Capitol Hill. Thanks to all of you. Kayla, I have to start with you and just get your reaction to this breaking news that the DOJ and SEC are investigating. What are the implications here? What are you going to be watching for as you track this investigation?
Well, certainly these agencies often open these parallel investigations. We just saw in December, the two agencies, as well as the CFTC, brought charges against Sam Bankman-Fried, the former head of FTX, the crypto exchange, on the same day. But ultimately, these agencies have different goals. The SEC is a civil regulator. It looks into whether there was misconduct, whether a company or an individual misrepresented what was happening in the business, its activities and its risks, and it can bar an individual from serving on boards or at companies, and it can claw back compensation. But the DOJ can file criminal charges, can put people in jail. So ultimately, if there are charges brought or if there are allegations leveled by the SEC or the DOJ, certainly that would indicate that something much more serious is going on. President Biden said earlier this week that he wanted to see someone or something be held accountable for the mess, in his words, at SVB. And we'll see what the outcome is, Kristen.
We absolutely will, Kayla. I guess the question becomes, because we also heard President Biden call on Congress to pass more regulations. And yet a member of the White House Economic Council who was on MSNBC earlier this afternoon talking about what specifically the administration can do right now in terms of regulation. I'm going to play a little bit and get your reaction on the other side.
There's quite a bit that we can do administratively without Congress. A lot of that actually is already underway with the new regulators that the president appointed over the last 2 years, taking their roles and starting to reverse some of the changes that we saw during the previous administration. There's more action that we can do in that space, and we are committed to getting that done. But there are going to be a set of things, most likely, that are going to require congressional action, since we had congressional action during the Trump administration that rolled back many of these rules in the first place. So we're going to do both.
So talk some specifics for us, Kayla. What do you anticipate seeing? And I just spoke to an administration official who didn't seem to know specifically everything they were going to ask of Congress yet.
Well, certainly, Kristen, on the administrative side that you just heard Bharat Ramamurthy talking about, personnel is policy. And already at the Federal Reserve, the official there in charge of regulation is studying whether to increase capital levels that banks are required to hold. But the problem is, even if Silicon Valley Bank had been subject to those stricter Dodd-Frank rules that Senator Warren was talking about having been rolled back in 2018, it likely wouldn't have mattered. When I talk to industry executives, they say it wasn't necessarily the amount of capital or, liquid assets or cash on hand that the bank had. It was the type of capital they had on hand and how risky it was. And the idea that the Federal Reserve needs to do a better job at running these rigorous hypothetical tests of exactly what is under the hood at each of the banks and whether it can withstand a situation like this. And simply put, Silicon Valley Bank's balance sheet was not able to withstand it. But even if it had been subject to some of those more rigorous tests, it's unclear that supervisors and regulators would have made any comment on it.
All right, Kayla, thank you for that. Seema, let me turn to you. Let's talk about how the markets are reacting today. As I noted at the top, they closed up for the first time in days. What do you make of the reaction today?
Well, Kristen, that is the hope. As indicated by today's sharp rebound on Wall Street, investors are trying to suss out the broader effect on banks. Over the past 24 hours, regional bank executives have broken their silence, expressing their confidence in their books, also trying to tell investors that their books look solid. We had the CEO of Charles Schwab on, that's a brokerage, just about 2 hours ago, delivering a message to customers that their money is safe. Separately, I did report in the last hour that private equity firms like KKR and Apollo Global are reviewing Silicon Valley Bank's loan book. No bids yet, but clearly a lot of discussion on the outlook, the fate of SVP and its assets, and at the same time, which regional banks could be in focus next.
Seema, based on your reporting, you've been talking to your sources, how much concern is there right now about so-called contagion, that we will start to see this happen in other banks? Is there a sense that this has stopped the bleeding for now?
We still don't have the final answer to that billion-dollar question, Kristen. I think the Moody's report today downgrading their rating on the financial sector. Unfortunate timing, right? Because the banks are currently in this place where they're trying to put their best foot forward and calm the markets down. And then you have a major credit rating agency changing its rating to negative from stable, citing the rapid deterioration in the operating environment and mentioning the deposit runs that we're seeing at SVP. They also added that it does expect other banks to come under pressure, right? So let's see if there's more there. The main thing to take away from Moody's report, though, is when you hear something like this, the concern is that this could impact credit ratings of the banks, which would result in higher borrowing costs and therefore impacts profitability. But again, the market didn't seem to react to that yet, with all the major financials trading sharply higher in today's trade, Kristen.
And of course, looming over all of this is what will the Fed do? And we'll get that answer on March 22nd, we expect.
Okay. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. We had the CPI report, which showed that inflation was high, but it was still in line with estimates. So there's still this sort of active discussion happening on how this will inform the Federal Reserve's decision. At the same time, trying to understand, with the failure of two banks over the weekend, how that is putting stress on the financial system and will also be factored in to Powell's decision on March 22nd. I think Fed fund futures, they right now are forecasting a 25 basis point rate hike.
Okay, well, we're all going to be watching that very closely. And that takes me to my next point, which is how everyday Americans are being impacted by this. Brian, let me turn to you for that. What should folks be taking away from this moment? It seems like things right now have stabilized, at least for the time being.
Yeah, and when it comes to just what average Americans need to do with regards to the bank failures over the past week or so, we need to remember that deposit insurance covers average American deposits up to $250,000 per depositor as well. And with regards to what's happening at Silicon Valley Bank, Silvergate, and also Signature Bank, those banks are not your banks. Those were banks that were banking primarily businesses, tech firms, private equity, venture capital funds, those types of businesses. So that's really the focus of what's happening on Capitol Hill with regards to the backstops that they put in place. It's not the same types of deposits that they're trying to back that would be savings deposits that all of us would be familiar with. So an important distinction there. Obviously, all of that also coming alongside high inflation. So the overall economic outlook very much shaky, and the financial instability concerns certainly compounding that, Kristen.
I'm so glad you made that distinction, Brian. I do think it's an important one to keep in mind, and it's an important one to continue to emphasize. I do want to follow up with you on the Fed. You know, you have these rising inflation rates. We've been expecting another rate hike from the Fed. You just heard Seema talk about this, the fact that broadly speaking, they're expected to raise the rate maybe 0.25 basis points. What are your sources telling you? What are you anticipating?
Yeah, and by the way, the expectation prior to the bank failures over the weekend was that the Federal Reserve might have to get more aggressive on its interest rate hikes to take inflation down. So there was chatter that maybe they would move by half a percentage point. But the real challenge here for Jay Powell and those at the Federal Reserve is that how much higher can you make rates without breaking anything, given that we just saw over this weekend that something broke. So it was one of the dominoes to fall that led SVB to ultimately go under. Not the primary reason, but one reason was because of higher interest rates that led the portfolio that they ultimately sold at a loss to trigger the bank run Wednesday night into Thursday, ultimately into the FDIC's closure on Friday. So for the Federal Reserve, if they wanted to be more aggressive, now you're thinking, if I do that, maybe that's going to break other banks as well. Hence the reason why markets are now repricing a smaller interest rate hike of perhaps a quarter percentage point. Some Wall Street firms even betting on maybe no interest rate hike at all. We'll have to see next Wednesday.
And just very quickly, Brian, of course, as Seema notes, the million-dollar question is, will this lead to contagion? What say you based on what you're seeing right now?
Yeah, well, there was certainly concern over First Republic Bank, although it seems like shares of that particular bank have recovered since then. By and large, it's hard to say exactly what's going to happen here as the credit ratings agencies like Moody's, for example, try to review what's happening with smaller regional banks. They flagged 6 as the potential for downgrade last night. But again, we'll have to see, at least for right now, though, encouraging that there wasn't more momentum after the government's moves on Sunday for other banks to ultimately go under.
So, Jake, let me turn to you now. Silicon Valley Bank executives obviously very much in the hot seat. NBC News, as we reported initially, has now confirmed that the DOJ and the SEC have these open investigations into the collapse. And now there's this talk on the Hill about legislation that could potentially claw back money from the bank's executives. What are you hearing there? What has the fallout been like, and what's the reaction to that?
Well, Kristen, we know at this point, based on reporting from NBC, that this, this investigation is going to be looking into trading that took place just before the collapse. We know that pre-scheduled stock trading was taking place a couple of weeks beforehand, that the CEO sold about $3.6 million worth of stock about 2 weeks beforehand. But this investigation is going to look into how much further it might have gone from that. And of course, the big thing here is a reputational issue, right? The CEOs and startup founders and VCs that I've been speaking to, say that up until a week ago, they never had to think about where their money was. They just assumed, as most Americans do, that their money was safe in the bank that they put it into. I was speaking to one VC who deals mostly in companies that operate abroad, companies that in many cases operate in countries where the banking system is not reliable. And one of the selling points of doing business here in the United States has always been the banking system. The idea that if you are in even an autocratic country, you can bring your money to the United States, do business here as a company, and rely on the banking system for reliability. And if it is in fact found that there was any kind of wrongdoing at this bank, that would put extra lemon into the deep cut of discovering that this bank, like so many banks, may not have been as reliable as we thought.
Well, there's just so much fallout to continue to track. And Jake, one other story we're following from the tech world today: Meta laying off 10,000 workers. What do you know about those cuts?
Yeah, this is a big piece of news in the tech industry. Meta announcing that it'll cut not just 10,000 jobs, but also an additional 5,000 open positions that it will not fill. This comes after the company cut 11,000 jobs in November. Mark Zuckerberg has called this the year of efficiency. The year of efficiency, and says that this will continue for quite some time. Important to note here, right? Silicon Valley Bank, in the filing that set off this whole debacle, basically blamed trouble in the tech sector for its needing to raise new money. And so that just adds to the sort of turbulence that we're looking at across the story right now, Kristen.
Yeah, and before I let you go, Jake, and turn to Ali on Capitol Hill, I do want to just get your sense of the implications for crypto, because all of these banks had ties to crypto. So what does that mean for the industry? We've all seen the commercials. What do you think the implications are?
Well, certainly we know that Signature Bank, that second bank in New York State that was closed after Silicon Valley Bank, was fairly well exposed to crypto. Silicon Valley Bank, it's important to note, was not. There were, of course, a couple of companies involved in that arena, but not in such a way that it characterizes the exposure. And so while crypto, continues to be a very unstable investment, it goes up, it goes down, and some people even question, whether it deserves to be a sector at all. But in this particular case, this really does have to do with what everyone else here has been talking about, right? This panic, this contagion, this question of whether the fundamentals here were observed, and whether, crypto played a part in it. That really is not clear. But at this hour, it seems that there's a lot of other issues that contribute to this other than crypto, Kristen.
All right, Jake, covering a lot of angles for us today. Thank you so much. Ali, let me now turn to you on Capitol Hill. There is a lot of finger pointing going on right now. Republicans pointing the finger at the Biden administration, blaming them for high inflation and thereby this collapse. And you have Democrats saying, hey, wait a minute. Regulations were put in place under Dodd-Frank after the 2008 collapse, and they were rolled back under former President Trump. So actually, Democrats are saying it's because of that this bank didn't have more liquidity, for example. What are you hearing today on Capitol Hill?
Yeah, round and round we go on the partisan wheel, Kristen, but that's pretty much par for the course here. In terms of what's actually tangibly happening going forward, the House is out right now. House Republicans are going to do their retreat next week. On the Senate side, they're in kind of a short week, but enough time for especially key senators who have been at the forefront of the push for more regulation on the banking systems, specifically someone who I spent a ton of time with in 2020, Senator Elizabeth Warren. They're pushing for regulation, pushing for more oversight. You got to imagine that once things get back into the full swing here, we're going to be seeing some hearings on this. Certainly, those are all going to be par for the course, but in terms of specific tangible legislation, even in just the last few minutes, NBC News was first to report a push from Senator Warren and Congresswoman Katie Porter on the House side that would put in place, snap back some of those regulations that were gotten rid of in 2018 by the Trump administration, but more regulations on these mid-level banks that they say are the root cause of SVB and the entire situation that we've seen over the course of the last few days, but would also prevent it from happening again. Now, you and I both know legislation does not move quickly around here, but certainly this is a fast reaction to something that has been a fast-moving story and that Congress is clearly eager to jump on. Whether or not they're actually ultimately able to do it is, of course, another story, especially given the divide in Congress with Republicans having an entirely different explanation for this than Democrats do.
Yeah, absolutely, Ali. And you mentioned Senator Warren. She had some pretty sharp criticism of Jerome Powell last night as well on MSNBC. Is there any talk about holding the Fed accountable? What are you hearing about that?
Look, that's always a conversation with Senator Warren. It's not shocking that she would go after Powell. She's someone who didn't support his renomination to begin with, so certainly not a new enemy for her. At the same time, though, as we get into the investigating portions of this, you got to imagine that people like Warren are going to call for Powell to sort of take a back seat. We've also seen her in just the last day or so target the ex-CEO of SVB, saying that they want and she wants explanation to those trades that Jake was just talking about there, the trades that were made before all of these problems with the bank began. So we're right now just in the information finding phase on Capitol Hill, but the battle lines are clear here, the players are clear, and we know who to watch in this space as it moves forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you characterize it so well. We are in the information phase, and that tracks with all of my reporting from the White House as well as they scramble with the fallout from this. Allie, thank you. And before that, Kayla, Seema, Brian, and Jake, fantastic start to the show. Coming up, unsafe and unprofessional. U.S. military officials slam the Russian Air Force after 2 fighter jets intercept and then collide with a U.S. drone over international waters. The latest on that story next. Plus, President Biden to take executive action on guns as he visits an L.A. suburb where 11 people were killed in a mass shooting earlier this year. The latest reporting from inside the administration ahead. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. The U.S. military was forced to down its own surveillance drone in the Black Sea today, following what the Pentagon is calling an unsafe and unprofessional intercept by 2 Russian fighter jets. According to a Department of Defense statement, the Russian jets dumped fuel and flew in front of the U.S. drone before striking the propeller, forcing the U.S. to bring it down. Now, the Pentagon says the incident follows a pattern of dangerous actions by Russian pilots while interacting with U.S. and allied aircraft in international airspace. The State Department says they have summoned the Russian ambassador over the incident. That meeting is expected to take place this afternoon. Russia is denying it came into contact with the U.S. drone. Joining me now is NBC News Pentagon correspondent Courtney Kube, who has been all over this story since we first learned about it. So, Court, what are the key headlines for you coming out of this?
So this intercepts are not uncommon, okay? And what that generally is another aircraft, like a Russian aircraft, following close to another nation's aircraft, maybe getting a little too close at some times, but nothing like what we saw here today. What makes today stand out, Kristen, is number one, these 2 Russian aircrafts, they were Su-27, so they're a fighter aircraft. They were weaving in and out in front of this unmanned U.S. drone. It's called an MQ-9. They were weaving around it. They were flying too close to it. They were dumping fuel on it. It's the first time I've ever heard of that happening in an intercept like this. And then at one point, one of the aircraft, while it was trying to dump that fuel on the MQ-9, it collided with it. So the Su-27's wing clipped the MQ-9's propeller, causing damage to both aircraft. We know now that the Russian aircraft, according to U.S. defense officials, was able to land back in Crimea, but the U.S. had to make the decision to down that unmanned drone in the Black Sea. Defense officials telling us that they were able to wipe out the software to ensure that if it gets into enemy hands, that they won't be able to exploit any of that information, anything that might be classified on that drone. That gets us to the issue of recovery. Now, the U.S. military doesn't have any ships in the Black Sea. And remember, the way you get into the Black Sea is through the Bosphorus Straits. It's controlled by the Turkish government. They have been resistant to allowing warships to go through into the Black Sea in recent months. Not to mention the fact it's not a quick process. So the reality here is, Kristen, right now the Russian military has a much better chance of getting to this wreckage faster than the U.S. military does.
And, Court, you know, I've been watching your reporting throughout the day, and you've made what I think is a really important point, which is that at this point in time, there seems to be a diplomatic intensity about this, and yet not an escalation militarily. Explain what you mean by that and what you're watching.
Exactly. So at this point, this is moving into a diplomatic space. And what I mean by that is there doesn't seem to be any talk of a military escalation or confrontation out of this. In fact, on the contrary, the people here I'm talking to are using words like reckless and inept flying by that Russian pilot. This seems to have been a case of a Russian pilot that just was not doing a good job flying in a relatively contested operational environment here. Defense officials here have actually been surprised, if not shocked, by how bad the flying appears to be. There is video that they have of it. We just haven't been able to see it yet here, Kristen. But so it seems as if there is no assessment at this point that this was an intentional downing of this U.S. drone. It's in the diplomatic space because at this point, the U.S. has summoned the Russian ambassador, as you mentioned. He's expected to be at the State Department this evening. We are expecting there to be further diplomatic actions and then conversations. The General Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, is trying to reach out to his Russian counterpart. At this point, we just don't have any indication that they've actually connected yet.
Okay, Courtney Hubie all over the breaking news for us. Thank you so much, Court. Really appreciate it. Up next, breaking with progressives, but sticking with Biden, how members of the president's own party are reacting to a number of controversial actions the administration is taking on crime, climate, and the border. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. President Biden is set to deliver remarks on efforts to reduce gun violence in Monterey Park, California, where 11 people were killed in a mass shooting during a celebration of the Lunar New Year in January. He will also sign an executive order aimed at increasing background check compliance. The political push on guns comes as President Biden has broken with progressives on a number of hot-button issues, seeking to neutralize potential attacks from Republicans in the run-up to 2024. Yesterday, his administration gave the green light to a major oil drilling project in Alaska. The White House is considering restarting the controversial family detention policy at the border. And President Biden has said he'll sign Republican-sponsored legislation to overturn a new D.C. crime law that would ease mandatory sentences and penalties. Joining me now to discuss this from outside the White House is Ali Rafa. Ali, thanks so much for joining me this afternoon. So what are you expecting to hear from President Biden when he does speak today? I'm told his remarks are going to be incredibly somber.
Yeah, Kristen, it's notable that the president will be visiting a community still reeling and still healing from a recent mass shooting. That mass shooting happening at a Lunar New Year celebration in January where 9 people were killed. And we expect this executive action he's going to be speaking about to really strengthen what he already has said he was proud of in the passage and signing of the bipartisan gun legislation passed in Congress last year, really the strongest gun legislation we've seen over the last 30 years. But President Biden even said after that it didn't really hit everything on his wish list. He still wants more. So barring any further action with Congress, he's really strengthening and maximizing his presidential power to get as much out of this gun legislation as possible. This executive action will call on the Attorney General to make sure that federally licensed guns, firearm dealers know and remind them that they have to conduct background checks for their customers to be able to continue having that federal license. That's all in an effort to make sure less guns get into the hands of people who shouldn't have them. It'll also expand those red flag laws that passed for people under the age of 21 last year. That already a law in 19 states, plus the District of Columbia, giving people the opportunity and the ability to report people who they say are a danger to themselves and others. It calls on the FTC to release information they have publicly on how guns are being advertised more to minors. Those gun manufacturers, in some cases, using military imagery to appeal more to minors. It'll also, what I think is interesting, call for more action from the Biden administration to take part in these communities that are still healing and still reeling after these mass shootings. We see that so often after things like hurricanes, these natural disasters, where FEMA stays for months in some cases to help those communities. The Biden administration calling for a similar type of action, a similar type of attention to these communities that are healing from these mass shootings, Kristen.
All right, Ali Rafa, thank you so much. Appreciate your reporting. Joining me now is Congressman Jamaal Bowman, a New York Democrat and a member of the House Progressive Caucus. Congressman, thank you so much for joining me today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
So I want to start on what you heard my colleague Ali Rafa talking about, the fact that President Biden is signing an executive order essentially trying to reinforce and strengthen background checks. Does this executive order go far enough?
No, it doesn't. And first and foremost, it's on us in Congress to write a bill to effectively ban assault rifles in our country. Unfortunately, too many of my colleagues do not have the courage to do this. So we need for the president to stretch his authority as far as it can go and seek to use executive action to ban assault rifles. Now, this will probably be challenged in court, but if it is, so be it. The American people need to see that we are fighting with them and for them. The ban or a ban on assault rifles is very popular. It always polls very well. And we know that it will ultimately save lives of vulnerable people in our society. I mean, just last year, we had a mass shooting in Buffalo, New York, and we have very good gun laws. So this is an epidemic. It's been an epidemic for a while, and we need for the president to be as aggressive as possible.
Well, Congressman, let me challenge you on that, because the Biden administration would say exactly what your point is, which is that if the president were to issue an executive action and try to ban assault rifles, it would be challenged in court. It would go nowhere, likely. They would make the argument, why not put our energy towards something that can actually be implemented and not face that level of a legal challenge? So why not put the energy toward getting something passed in Congress? And is that realistic, given that the votes are not there for an assault weapons ban?
Well, we have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. Absolutely, Congress needs to act. There's no question about it. But when the president takes executive action, it needs to make a strong statement to the American people, and it shouldn't feel like it's nibbling around the edges.
But shouldn't an executive action be more than making a statement, Congressman?
The American people need to see that we're fighting for them. And many of them feel helpless and hopeless because they consistently tell me in my district and consistently tell me around the country that you guys aren't getting anything done. Now, obviously, that's an exaggeration. There's been many things that have been done. However, on the issue of assault rifles, we have Moms Demand Action. We have so many groups that have been organizing for years to ban assault rifles. The president needs to stand with us, and he has been for the most part, but we need him to be stronger and heavy-handed and louder on fighting for the issues we know the American people care about, if it's challenged in court or not.
Before we turn to other issues, given that the votes just are not there for an assault weapons ban, should voters see a renewed push for this as realistic or something that's being done against the backdrop of 2024?
So voters, yes, should see it as realistic, but we have to push and fight to show them that it's realistic. Let me also say this. Voters need to speak loudly and clearly in 2024, not just in terms of the presidency, but there are many Senate races that are in play where you have senators who do not support an assault weapons ban running for re-election, and we need voters to not stay home. Please do not stay home. Come out and vote the right people into office so that we could get this done, both on the Senate side and on the House side as well.
Congressman, let me turn to the administration's announcement on oil drilling, green lighting plans to drill oil in Alaska, despite pushback from lawmakers like yourself and environmentalists. Do you see this move as a betrayal by the president?
Yes, it is ill-advised.
So it's a betrayal?
Dangerous. Yes, and it is ill-advised. And it is dangerous for our climate. There's no scientific support for more drilling anywhere in our country. It's been stated that we should stop drilling. The president said he would not drill on federal lands. He said this during his campaign. So this is another case that probably would have gone to the courts if he would just have simply said no. But so what? Go to the courts and fight and cite the fact that our country is warming at a rapid rate. And if it continues to warm, we will see more death and destruction. Bottom line. So the president should have stood firmly and stood against this. The young people who organized to get him into office, this is their number one issue. And God forbid they stay home in 2024 and we get a Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis presidency. We need for historic leadership from President Biden on this issue and many others, because we're dealing in unprecedented times.
Congressman, let me get your broader reaction, because as we reported at the top, this is not the only issue where the president has broken with progressives. He's also voted to overturn that D.C. crime law, as well as reporting that the administration is considering bringing back family detentions. The chair of the Progressive Caucus said this, quote, "I still believe that in the vast majority of areas that he has been terrific, and he's the most progressive president we've had." Do you agree with that assessment? It sounds like you don't.
He's done very well on many issues. The Inflation Reduction Act is one example.
But is he the most progressive president, Congressman?
Well, I would have to study the history of all the presidents to answer that question. But let me say this. He's done some things very well. The Inflation Reduction Act is a big win. We see historic investments in dealing with the issue of climate change in that bill. In his most recent budget, he's looking to cut subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. Absolutely. But we need for the president to not take one step forward and then two steps back. So, yes, he's done a lot well. He's running for re-election. He will have my support. But if I don't speak up and if others don't speak up and we don't push him, the reason why he's this progressive is because we've organized and pushed him both inside of Congress and outside of Congress.
Congressman, and we're running out of time. So one more question, and we should note the president has started his remarks on his executive action in California as we speak. Do you believe that the president is the strongest person to represent progressives in 2024?
That's a tough question because, again, we would like to see him go further on many issues.
However, are you saying he should be primaried, Congressman?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying we got to continue to organize and push and fight like hell so that he could be even more progressive. We have an affordability crisis in our country and many other issues that we want the president to be aggressive on. So we're going to continue to be loud and clear and push him to be progressive on those issues. Housing, healthcare, jobs, entrepreneurship, inequality, climate. We need him to go further.
Congressman Jamaal Bowman, thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciate it. After the break, former President Trump takes aim at Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, while DeSantis takes aim at the war in Ukraine. Those developments and what they mean for the Republican Party. The panel's next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Turning to the campaign trail now, where the 2024 Republican primary is heating up. Former President Donald Trump held his first event in Iowa last night in front of roughly 2,000 people, taking a number of shots at his potential Republican rival, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, at one point comparing him to the party's failed 2012 candidate, Mitt Romney. The former president also told a group of reporters he maybe regretted endorsing DeSantis for governor. And fresh off his recent swing through Iowa, Governor DeSantis is making some waves for his stance on the war in Ukraine. Responding to a questionnaire from Fox's Tucker Carlson, DeSantis writing, while the U.S. has many vital national interests, becoming further entangled in a territorial dispute between Ukraine and Russia is not one of them. Joining me now on set is Mariana Sotomayor, congressional reporter for The Washington Post, Democratic pollster Margie Omero, and Brendan Buck, former advisor to Republican speakers John Boehner and Paul Ryan, as well as an NBC News political analyst. Thanks to all of you for being here. So, Brendan, let me start with you and what we're hearing from DeSantis on Ukraine. It matches what we're hearing from Trump. Is this where the battle lines are going to be drawn?
Yeah, and it shows the real shift in the party. I mean, this is remarkable. The party of Ronald Reagan is now basically siding with basically Russia's talking points on this conflict. And it shows not only are we more of an isolationist party, but the work that Donald Trump has been doing over the last couple of years to kind of build up, or for many years, build up Russia is having an impact. Clearly, Ron DeSantis went to Tucker Carlson, of all people, to make this announcement. Shows you how important that audience is, and he's really, really concerned clearly about the sort of Fox News primary, making that argument. This is disappointing. It's a place where I think he could have very easily differentiated himself with Donald Trump, but I think it actually comes from a place of weakness. He felt like he had to be on the same page as Donald Trump here. He doesn't want to lose any of those voters. Disappointing, as a matter of what this Republican Party stands for, but also just speaks to what the kind of campaign that Ron DeSantis is going to run.
Yeah, and Mariana, it's so notable. I mean, as Brendan talks about, this is not the party of Ronald Reagan. We're witnessing this shift, but how does that potentially play in a Republican primary? How does Putin hear these words? How does NATO hear these words? And how might that argument find its way onto debate stages?
Yeah, you mentioned the transition. Even Ron DeSantis has had that evolution. In 2015, when Russia was trying to annex Crimea, he was saying, you know what, we need to be proactive. We should be helping and making sure that, Russia does not do this. It is a total 180. And it really is something that, at least on the Hill, you do hear Republicans say. I've been hearing from my constituents, we should be pulling out. We should not be helping in any form or fashion. I've even heard that from some House Democrats who do represent swing districts, their own constituents also saying that. There isn't as much of a break. We obviously have seen a number of those House Republicans in particular say, yes, that Trump position. But there are still some who are trying to inform their constituencies and saying this is good for us as a democracy. But we'll really see that fight play out way later on
It's
this
just
year.
an issue where usually the adults in the room in Congress, I would say, like, will take care of it. And there are some people who will take some shots and they'll make some points. And Matt Gaetz will say, don't send money over there, send it to Florida. That's fine. But ultimately, the leaders make the decisions. And here may be a place where this could be the next president of the United States, and he's taking out this position. It's notable.
Well, that's why a lot of Republican senators criticized DeSantis for the way he spoke and said, you know, there's clearly something he's not paying attention to.
Marco Rubio,
Lindsey Graham, others said, you know, he's lost the plot a little bit because obviously this is about trying to contrast with Biden. Biden's doing something, I'm against it, and it's not showing the kind of nuanced leadership people want.
In a general election, when you think about the polling that we have now for support for Ukraine, broadly speaking, the majority of Americans still support sending aid to Ukraine, but it has been dropping a bit, Margie, right?
I think when people think about this, they're thinking, and when they say, I'm concerned, they're approaching this through the lens of, I feel stressed. I feel my community is stressed. And so I just want to make sure there is attention paid to my community, not because people have switched their allegiances. And so when you have DeSantis use this really political language, it's just really at odds with anything that you hear from swing voters or people who are not just reflexively anti whatever the administration does.
One of the things we heard from Donald Trump on the campaign trail in Iowa is he took a swipe at your former boss. I want to play this soundbite and get your reaction on the other side.
Ron was a disciple of Paul Ryan, who is a rhino loser who currently is destroying Fox and would constantly vote against entitlements. Paul Ryan's a big reason that Mitt Romney, I'm not a big fan of Mitt Romney, lost his election. And to be honest with you, Ron reminds me a lot of Mitt Romney. So I don't think you're going to be doing so well here, but we're going to find out. But those are the facts.
Brendan, you're saying that the party is becoming more isolationist, but how do those comments play, broadly speaking, in a primary, do you think?
I mean, it may work in a primary. I don't know. I think if you have a party that doesn't have room for Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan, it's probably a pretty small party, and it's not the type of way to win a general election. Look, Donald Trump is clearly trying to find some attacks on Ron DeSantis that stick, and he's been swinging at him for a while, and it doesn't feel like he's really made any real connections here. Maybe that one will work. I don't know. But it's very clear that he's focused on him. He knows that this is the person who poses the most danger to him, and so he's going to throw everything he can at him.
It's still so early, but one of the things that I hear from allies of former President Trump is he's not saying anything remarkably new, Mariana. And the question becomes, how does he give voters that same jolt of enthusiasm to go out and vote for him over a DeSantis who is catching up to him in the polls when he's not giving anything new?
Not to mention a voter base that is actually pretty skeptical of Trump, right? We have seen in some of the polling, too, a little bit of separation from where Trump was at this point in time or when he was really doing well in the previous Republican primary. I mean, it really isn't anything new. And you really do hear that from Republicans just trying to say, OK, how can we defend him? I think that's a little bit of why you see Republicans a little bit holding back, not fully endorsing him yet.
Margie, let me just ask you about the polling, this new CNN poll, because I know you want to talk about this. It says that more Republicans actually prefer a candidate that shares their positions than one with a strong chance to beat President Biden. What do you make of that?
I mean, I guess it is okay because the policies are also really unpopular. So Republican policies are not popular in a general election. And in that same poll, there were a couple things that I found pretty interesting. One, they had a list of how essential is this was a poll of just Republicans. How essential is this to your vote for a Republican candidate for president? And one of the top things was, we'll protect Social Security and Medicare and not change it, which is really the opposite of where a lot of people in the Republican caucus are. But that was one of the number one things.
Fascinating.
The other thing that I thought was pretty funny was they had this question, was Trump helpful, harmful, or no impact on the Republican Party? And quite a few said harmful, but like 15%, like not zero, like said no impact. He's had no impact on the Republican Party. So I'm just interested in what that 15%, he's had no real change on the Republican Party one way or the other.
It's just the contours of that are fascinating. I just interviewed Congressman Bowman, and he waffled about whether President Biden, I want to talk about the Democrats before we go, is the strongest person to represent progressives. He said, look, he's going to back him, Mariana, but he certainly was also quite critical of the president for breaking with progressives on some key issues from crime and now potentially immigration, climate, with this new order allowing drilling in Alaska. How big of an issue is that for the president when you think about his core supporters?
Well, the president has had to, and even during his campaign, we remember, really has tried to make sure that he was listening to that progressive base because it is a part of the party. Now you're seeing Biden kind of preparing to jump right back in and, again, talk to a wider base. And yes, House Democrats are very upset. It is not insignificant that Bowman, who was even more critical in the past about the president and his progressiveness, the fact that he said that he supports him, that's a pretty big deal. That is a change. Yeah. However, they are very upset. They're upset at the fact that Ron Klain has left. They blame that personnel changes currently at the White House as a big reason why they no longer have they can just pick up the phone and call the White House and say, let us know what's happening. So it's a little bit of that, too, that the White House seems to need to do a better job to just assuage a lot of those concerns.
All right. Great conversation, you guys. Thank you so much, Mariana, Margie, and Brendan. Really appreciate it. And still to come, dozens of Democratic governors and senators ramp up pressure on Walgreens and U.S. pharmacy giants on the issue of access to abortion pills. Where the fight goes from here with the reporter who broke that story next. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. The Texas judge overseeing the high-stakes case over abortion pills scheduled the first hearing in the case for tomorrow as we weigh whether or not to halt the sale of the drug mifepristone nationwide while the case proceeds. Meanwhile, on Capitol Hill today, 17 Senate Democrats pressed Walgreens for more details about its plan to restrict access to the mifepristone in certain states. Those lawmakers, as well as 14 Democratic governors, in a separate letter, wrote to other major pharmacies, including CVS and Rite Aid, asking them to clarify their plans for dispensing the abortion pill. Joining me now is Chloe Atkins, who covers reproductive rights and policy for NBC News. Chloe, thanks so much for joining me. Really appreciate it. So what are you watching for? What should we expect in this hearing tomorrow?
Kristen, good to be with you. All eyes are on Texas, where a judge will hold a hearing on a preliminary injunction that seeks to take one of the two pills used in medication abortion off the market. Now, Kristen, it does remain unclear when this judge will rule. He could rule as soon as tomorrow. Or he could rule in the days or the weeks to come. It truly remains unknown at this moment. But if the judge does rule to take mifepristone off the market, what we would see is major national implications, and those who are seeking abortion access, even in blue states, would be impacted by this this order from the judge. And we would also likely see physicians and doctors transition from this two-pill regimen to a misoprostol-only regimen that is just as safe but is less effective, Kristen.
Yeah, and I know there are some concerns about that because it is meant to be a two-pill regimen. Chloe, put this into context. What are the broader implications here? Because we know that this is obviously a battle that is unfolding nationwide over not just the abortion pill, but access to abortion writ large.
Absolutely. And I mean, we even saw last night where, senators and even governors spoke out in letters putting pressure on Walgreens, CVS, and Rite Aid to further define where they stood on their policies in dispensing abortion pills and how they planned to do so in the days to come. And that came after Walgreens announced that it would dispense medication abortion in multiple states around the country, including in states where abortion is both legal and illegal. And they made that announcement after around 20 GOP AGs sent letters to all of these pharmacies threatening legal action if they decided to dispense medication abortion in their states. Now, it does remain unclear where these companies are within the certification process. That is something that we are pushing day in and day out to understand better where they are in that process. And we also are looking to hear from Rite Aid and CVS on whether or not they will be dispensing medication abortion in those 20 states where AGs spoke out threatening legal action. Kristen.
Let me just follow up very quickly. We have about 30 seconds left. How much confusion will there be if pharmacies take a different tack than whatever is ruled in this case?
In my conversations, Kristen, with abortion rights groups and doctors, they told me that there's already a ton of confusion and misinformation when it comes to abortion access in this country, and especially as it relates to medication abortion. And they said if these pharmacies take different stances in dispensing medication abortion around the country, it will only add fuel to that fire. So they are applauding these lawmakers, both governors and senators, for sending these letters and asking for clarifications in their policies.
All right, Chloe Atkins, thank you so much. And thank you for being with us this hour. Chuck is back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now. NBC News Now coverage continues with Hallie Jackson.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.